Forever and Always, written by Wondrous Wendy. Narrated by Ranger Zath. Rating: Explicit. Archive warning: graphic depictions of violence. Categories: female/female, female/male, male/male. Fandom: Control. Relationships: Casper Darling / Zachariah Trench. Characters: Casper Darling, Zachariah Trench, Helen Marshall, Broderick Northmore, Theodore Ashe Jr., Kate Trench, Susanna Trench, original female character. Additional tags: Alternate universe, vampire. Explicit sexual content. Boss/employee relationship. Human/vampire relationship. Requited/unrequited love. Canon typical violence. Blood and injury. POV alternating. Angst. Hurt/comfort. Humor. Susanna lives and Trench gets to be a dad. Human/monster romance. Summary. In the aftermath of the Rite of Blood and becoming director, Zachariah Trench must rearrange every facet of his life to accommodate the monstrous creature he has become. Casper Darling would do anything to spare the man he secretly loves the indignity of vampirism. Notes: this story will not have all of the potential tags up front. I'm trying something different and don't want to spoil elements of the story. Since this is a vampire AU, expect the usual: blood, blood drinking, and violence. This story will predominantly focus on Trench/Darling, but it will also feature references to Northmore/Ashe and Marshall/female OC. I hope you enjoy this journey. I also wanted to give a huge shout out to Zath for help with elements of the story, namely some key narrative beats and perspective on the overall ending. Chapter 1. Zachariah Trench was told that all directors choose to be chosen for the role. Yet, as blood gushes from his neck while Northmore draws life from his veins, he realizes there is no choice in the matter. He's going to die. One cycle ends, another begins. Theodore Ashe Sr. turned Broderick Northmore decades ago. The Rite of Blood, as it became known, involved the passing of more than just executive authority. Vampirism heightened paranatural affinity, bestowed eternal life, and allowed directors to command the oldest house without refusal. Only a select few knew about the altered nature of the person in charge. It's the best-kept secret within the institution. No power comes without a price. Northmore served as the Bureau's leader for 2 decades, but like his predecessor, vampirism began to take a toll upon the director. Bucking precedent, Northmore made no move to advocate his throne, even as the sickness began to rot his mind. Instead of accepting his fate and seeking out a successor, Northmore resisted the calls from the board to retire. He drove Theodore Ashe Jr., his head of research and suspected thrall, to find a way to cure the illness before it consumed him. Dr. Ashe reached the same conclusions as every head of research before him. The sickness could not be cured. Northmore would live, but his sanity would further and further erode until all semblance of humanity had evaporated. He would become an animal, incapable of leading the Bureau. Northmore forced Ashe to retire and promoted a young scientist in his stead, Casper Darling, one of Ashe's best junior assistants. Northmore instructed Darling to seek out the same cure. To his credit, Dr. Darling tried. Perhaps his own ego drove him to stay late at the Bureau most nights. Perhaps it was the fear of the executioner's axe poised over his head. Back then, Trench had worked his way up the Bureau ranks and became the Deputy Chief of Security. Like other department heads, he learned the truth only a handful of people at the Bureau understood. The director was more than just a man with psychic abilities. Their boss was a creature Trench had only heard of in urban legends and B-movies. A vampire. Trench came to see Darling during those late evenings in his laboratory. So much of their work involved the paranatural, blurring the lines between fact and fiction. But Trench served as a touchstone to keep Darling grounded. Even when the Bureau tested their sanity and resolve, they remained close friends. Few around the Bureau could make Trench laugh in the ways Darling could. Their rapport contrasted his far more serious friendship with Marshall, and Darling was nothing like his fiancée Kate. Over time, Trench could see the toll research into the sickness took on Darling. He juggled pursuing his own interests in the paranatural alongside Northmore's demands to find a cure. Darling didn't have much of a life outside the Bureau. Zachariah was his closest friend, but he otherwise was married to his job. In the end, Darling reached the same conclusions as his predecessor. Even if a cure was found, the deterioration of Northmore's DNA was too severe, irreversibly altered. If Northmore was lucky, he would have 5 years at best before he lost total control of his hunger. Despite Trench telling him to never reveal his conclusions to the director, Darling didn't listen. "I'm tired of pursuing a hopeless goal, Zach," Darling told him. "I can serve the Bureau best by putting my focus elsewhere." Trench should have known the moment he felt the oldest house shake. When his department received word of an incident in the research department over the radio, he already knew what it would be about. "It's a bloodbath! Research! Northmore! Possessed! Marshall and Rangers are trying to restrain him!" Without hesitation, Trench raced down to research in terror. He needed to save Darling from the director's wrath at whatever cost. Darling was his best friend, who didn't deserve to be torn apart for telling Northmore the truth. Trench crossed paths with the director on his way to Darling's personal lab. Northmore stood slumped against the wall, his clothes and hands, claws, Trench realized, stained in blood. He drew his gun and pointed it at Northmore. "Stand down, Director." Abiding by tradition at last, Northmore faced his fate and chose his successor. He hated Trench, so the decision came without guilt or regret. He was too fast, too strong, more animal than man. He didn't flinch even as bullets pierced through his chest. He closed the gap in what felt like 2 impossible strides, and Trench crashed to the concrete floor. The impact knocked the breath out of his lungs, stunning him long enough for Northmore to draw back, then clamp down. Trench howled in pain as long fangs sharper than knives drove deep into his skin, tearing through muscle, penetrating into bone to reach marrow. He tried to push Northmore off. He struggled for as long as he could until his body lost feeling. He grew colder and colder, incapable of moving. So there Zachariah Trench lies, slowly dying at Northmore's hand. When Northmore releases him at last, gore stains his mouth and clings to his fangs. He looms over his prey, smirking viciously. "There is no worse fate than seeing those you love wither and die while you remain behind as a monster," Northmore proclaims, his voice booming. He clenches a fist and lets blood drip off his claws, splattering onto Trench's face and sliding past his lips. "This is my gift and my curse." The wretched smell of his own blood curdles in his stomach. His vision blurs, and he hears Northmore retreat down the hall. As he lays on the hard concrete dying, Zachariah prays for Darling to survive the carnage. The last thing he hears is the muffled cry of someone shouting his name. This is Zath, signing off until the next chapter. I'll see you back here next time with Forever and Always, a Control fanfic by Wondrous Wendy.